Rain soaked the pavement outside Penn Station, neon lights bleeding into puddles like secrets that refused to stay buried. I, Evelyn Carter, stood under the awning with my suitcase between my feet, pretending I was just another woman waiting for a ride. Anyone watching would have thought I was nervous. I wasn't. I was calculating. A black sedan rolled to the curb and stopped without ceremony. No logo, no uniform, just an engine still running and a man who didn't bother getting out. He looked at me through the windshield. Not the way men usually do. Not hungry. Not curious. Measured. That should have been my first warning. I opened the back door and slid inside, the leather seat cool beneath my palms. "You the client?" he asked. His voice was calm. Too calm. "Yes." He glanced at my hands. No ring. No tremor. "Name?" "Not tonight." A pause. Most men would have insisted. He shifted the car into drive instead. That was when I knew this was going to be dangerous. We merged onto the highway, rain tapping the roof like impatient fingers. The radio hummed low, Springsteen singing about escape, about towns that swallowed people whole. He drove like someone who'd been followed before, checked mirrors, changed lanes without warning. Never too fast, never slow. I watched him from the corner of my eye. "You always this careful?" I asked. "Only when the money's clean." I smiled faintly. "Is mine?" He glanced at me for half a second, long enough to register my face, not long enough to give anything away. "That depends who you are." I leaned back, folding my hands in my lap. "Then keep driving." Silence settled between us, thick and intentional. Silence can be a weapon. I used it to learn him, scar at his jawline, faint, old, hands steady on the wheel, eyes that didn't soften, even when the song did. "You're not asking questions?" I said. "You don't want answers," he replied. Another warning. He chose the motel outside Wilmington. Low, cheap, the kind of place no one remembered twice. Room nearest the stairs, window latch checked, curtains pulled. He set my suitcase on the bed carefully, like it was heavier than it looked. "You don't look like someone running from a husband," he said. I turned slowly. "What do I look like?" He hesitated, just long enough. "Someone running toward something worse." My pulse jumped, annoyed that he was right. "Is that part of the job?" I asked. "No," he said. "That's experience." I slipped off my coat. "Then experience should tell you not to guess." His jaw tightened. "You paying me to drive," he said, "or to lie? Tonight?" I met his eyes. "Both." At 2:13 a.m., I slipped out of the room barefoot. Not because I wanted to escape, because I wanted to see if Jack Mercer would let me. The hallway smelled like stale smoke and bleach. The ice machine rattled at the far end, loud enough to hide footsteps. I didn't make it halfway. His hand closed around my wrist in the dark. Not rough, not gentle. Controlled. "Bad idea," he said quietly. I looked up at him, close enough now to see the faint lines around his eyes. "Is that concern?" I whispered. "That's experience." I tried to pull free. He didn't tighten his grip, but he didn't let go either. "If you disappear," he continued, "they'll blame me." "Who's they?" I asked, a beat. "The ones who paid." I smiled, slow and deliberate. "Then we understand each other." His grip loosened. He stepped back. "Go inside," he said. I did, but neither of us slept after that. The diner smelled like coffee and regret. Vinyl booths cracked with age, a waitress who didn't bother asking names. He ordered black coffee. I ordered nothing. He noticed. "You always skip breakfast?" he asked. "Only when eating makes me predictable." He snorted. "You're doing a great job not being." I stirred my empty cup. "Why did you take this job?" "Money." "That's not true." He watched steam rise from his coffee. "No, but it's the safe answer." I leaned closer. "I don't pay for safe." His gaze flicked to my mouth, then back to my eyes. "That's so?" he said. "Yes." Something shifted then, subtle, like a chess piece moved without announcement. You're testing me, he said. I didn't deny it. What happens if I fail? He asked. I smiled. You walk away richer. And you? I shrugged. I disappear. His jaw tightened. We noticed the Buick at the edge of the lot at the same time. Didn't look at it. Didn't need to. When we pulled out, it followed. Don't turn your head, he murmured. I'm not afraid, I said. That's your problem. He opened the glove box just enough for me to see what was inside. Metal. Oiled. Familiar. A gun. I didn't flinch. He glanced at me then, really looked. You expected that? He said. Yes. Why? Because men who don't ask questions usually prepare for answers they don't want. That earned me a long look. He pulled onto a dark shoulder and killed the engine. Rain hit harder now. Louder. Tell me the truth, he said. Right now. I stared at the dashboard. My reflection wavered in the glass. A woman between names, between lives. I could have lied. I didn't. My name is Evelyn Carter, I said finally. Silence. He studied me like he was recalculating the odds. The Carter Foundation? He asked quietly. Yes. And you hired me anyway? Yes. Why? Because I needed to know if you'd sell me. And? I met his eyes. Would you? Another pause, then quietly. Not for that. Relief hit me harder than fear. We crossed into New Jersey just before midnight. He stopped at a payphone while I waited in the car. When he came back, his face had changed. Someone's asking questions, he said. About you. My stomach dropped. He handed me the receiver. A man's voice came through, smooth, polite. Miss Evelyn Carter? He said, using my real name. Your family would like you to come home. I closed my eyes. What if I don't? I asked, a smile I could hear through the line. Then we stopped asking nicely. I hung up, met my escort's gaze, and understood something too late. I hadn't hired a stranger. I'd hired Jack Mercer, a man with his own ghosts, and now we were both in danger. The payphone receiver still swung slightly when I set it down. My real name echoed in my ears like a slap. He watched my face, not asking questions yet, waiting to see what cracked first. You okay? He asked. I nodded too quickly. We need to go. That wasn't an answer. It's the only one you're getting right now. Rain slicked the pavement as we pulled back onto the highway. The Buick was gone. That didn't make me feel better. You recognize the voice, he said. Yes. And if they're calling now, I replied, it means someone made a mistake. His jaw tightened. Yours? No, I said. Theirs. He chose another motel just outside Newark. Smaller. Worse. The kind of place no one checked in for more than one night. Inside, the room smelled like old carpet and stale air. He checked the door, the window, the bathroom. Sleep, he said. We moved before dawn. I nodded, though I knew I wouldn't. My thoughts were too loud. They knew where I was. They knew who I'd hired, and they'd decided subtlety was optional. At some point, exhaustion dragged me under. I woke to a smell. Sweet. Metallic. Wrong. He stood near the desk, cup in hand. Don't! I said sharply. He froze. Too late. I lunged, knocking the cup from his grip. Ceramic shattered. Coffee splashed across the carpet. What the hell? Don't drink it, I said. Please. He stared at the spill, then at me. Explain. Before I could, there was a soft sound at the door. Not a knock, a drag, like fingernails across wood. His hand went to his jacket. I stepped in front of him. They're not here for you, I whispered. His eyes locked onto mine. Then who are they here for? For my obedience. The handle rattled once, then again. He moved fast, pulled me into the bathroom, lights off, door cracked just enough to see. 2 shadows passed outside. Footsteps. A pause. Then silence. We stayed frozen for a full minute after the sound faded. When it was over, he looked at me like I was something fragile and explosive at the same time. You want to tell me now? He asked quietly. I exhaled. If I tell you everything, you might leave. And if you don't, he replied, we both die. Fair point. We sat on opposite beds, space between us thick with unspoken things. There's a foundation, I began. Old money. Older rules. He listened without interrupting. They need my signature on a marriage contract. Business disguised as tradition. Arranged, he said flatly. Yes. And you ran. I delayed, I corrected. Running would make them hunt me. His eyes darkened. So you hired me to, what, buy time? No, I said. To watch you. That landed hard. You're testing me? He asked. Yes. What happens if I fail? I met his gaze. You get paid. And you? I disappear. Silence. Then softly. That's a hell of a thing to put on a stranger. You weren't supposed to matter, I said. His mouth twitched. I always hate that part. We left before sunrise. Back roads, no stops. He drove like someone who'd made a decision he didn't love, but owned. You should know, he said. I don't like being used. I know. And I don't like bullies. I glanced at him. Is that why you stayed? No, he said. That's why I didn't leave. Something in my chest loosened. That scared me more than the men chasing us. Later, we stopped at a roadside diner. This time, I ate. He noticed. Feeling brave? He asked. No, I replied. Feeling human? His jacket found its way around my shoulders again. This time, I didn't pretend it was accidental. Our knees brushed under the table. Electric. Immediate. I hated how much I wanted him to touch me. You always this calm under pressure? He asked. No, I said honestly. I just learned fear makes me useful to them. He studied me for a long moment. Then, not to me. We didn't notice the car until it was too late. A sedan this time. Dark, clean. He swore under his breath. Stay down, he said. I didn't argue. The sedan followed us for 3 exits. Then 4. At a red light, a man leaned out the passenger window. He smiled and held up a folder. My name was printed on it. Large, black, final. He pulled into a gas station. Bright lights, witnesses. The man approached us calmly. Suit. Polite smile. Miss Carter, he said. Your family is worried. I stepped out of the car. You poisoned his coffee, I said. Correction, the man replied. We attempted to persuade you. I laughed. You missed. His smile thinned. Sign the papers and we all go home. And if I don't, his eyes flicked to my escort. Then accidents happen. Before I could react, my escort stepped forward. She's not signing anything, he said. The man raised an eyebrow. You're very expensive for hired help. I'm not hired anymore, he replied. It happened fast. A blade flashed. He shoved me back. Pain split the air. Blood darkened his shirt. My scream tore out of me before I could stop it. He staggered, but stayed upright. The man backed away, startled. This isn't over, he said. I dropped to my knees beside him, hands shaking. You're bleeding? I whispered. He smiled faintly. Yeah, that's new. I dragged him into the bathroom, locked the door, pressed towels to his side. You didn't have to do that, I said, tears finally breaking free. He met my eyes, steady, unwavering. Yes, he said quietly. I did. I realized then that everything had changed. This wasn't an escort job. This wasn't a test. This was loyalty, and it terrified me. Because if he could bleed for me, they could use him to break me. The gas station bathroom smelled like antiseptic and rusted pipes. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering like they couldn't decide whether to stay on. I locked the door with shaking hands. Blood soaked through the towel pressed to his side. You're bleeding too much, I whispered. He leaned against the sink, jaw clenched, sweat beading on his forehead. I've had worse, he said. That's not comforting. I tore open a first aid kit with my teeth. Gauze, thread, alcohol wipes. You know how to stitch? He asked. I had to learn, I replied. I didn't say where. When I pressed the needle through his skin, he hissed, but didn't pull away. You're calm, he said. I'm not, I said. I'm focused. That was a lie. If I let myself feel what this meant, him bleeding because of me, I would break. When it was done, he sank onto the edge of the tub. I washed my hands slowly, avoiding his eyes. You still haven't told me everything, he said. I closed my eyes. If I do, I said, you'll understand why they don't care if I live, as long as I comply. Silence filled the room. Then, try me. I sat across from him on the cold tile floor. There is no other heiress, I said quietly. No distant cousin. No decoy. He frowned. I'm not running from a contract, I continued. I am the contract. His face changed. Slow, controlled, dangerous. You're the asset, Jack said. Yes. I told him everything. how my birth certificate had been filed like a deed, how my childhood had been shaped around appearances, how my value wasn't emotional, but financial. They built a foundation around my last name, I said, and then built a cage inside it. He listened without interrupting. They don't want a daughter, I said. They want continuity. He stared at the wall, knuckles white. And the marriage? He asked. Designed, I said, to merge money, silence dissent, keep control in-house. You refused. I delayed. He laughed once, sharp, bitter. So you hired me to see if I could be trusted not to sell you. Yes. And if I had? I swallowed. Then I would have disappeared quietly. He stood abruptly, pacing the small bathroom. You don't get to decide whether your life is collateral, he snapped. I didn't decide, I said. They did. He stopped pacing. Why me? He asked. Because you didn't ask my name, I said. Because you noticed the tail without panic. Because when you grabbed my wrist, you let go. He stared at me. I needed someone who could walk away, I said, and choose not to. A long pause. You're insane, he said quietly. Yes, I agreed, but I'm alive. We drove in silence for miles. Not the tense silence from before. This one was heavier, shared. The sky lightened as dawn approached, pale and uncertain. You could still leave, I said. He didn't look at me. I could, but you won't. No, I turned toward him. Why? His jaw tightened. Because if they own you, he said, then they think they own the rest of us too. That answer scared me, because it sounded like conviction. The next motel was quieter, cleaner. He insisted on cleaning the wound again. His fingers were careful now, intimate. When his thumb brushed my hip, my breath caught. Don't, I said softly. He froze. Don't what? He asked. Make this harder. He met my eyes. Too late. Lying on separate beds in the dark, he finally spoke. You know they'll come harder now. I know. You know they'll use me. I swallowed. Yes. Silence. Then, and you still want me here? I turned my head. Yes. A beat. Then don't lie to me again, he said. Not about anything. I promised. I meant it. By morning, we had a plan. Not escape. Exposure. There's a gala, I said. In New York. Of course there is. He replied. They'll expect me, I said. Alone. He looked at me sharply. Absolutely not. They won't move unless they think they've won, I said. He exhaled slowly. You walk into a room full of sharks, he said. And I stay outside? Yes. That's insane. I smiled faintly. So am I. Before we left, he stopped me at the door. If this goes wrong, it won't, I said. He shook his head. If it does, I met his eyes. Then I'll know I chose someone worth losing. His hand cupped my face. This time, he didn't stop himself. When he pulled away, his forehead rested against mine. I'm not letting them take you, he whispered. I closed my eyes. Neither of us knew what that would cost. That night, as we crossed into New York, his phone rang. He answered silently, then handed it to me. A man's voice came through, smooth, familiar. We know where you are, the voice said, and we're prepared to make him very wealthy. I looked at him. He met my gaze without blinking. I'm listening, I said into the phone, and realized something terrifying. The gala wasn't the trap. The choice was. The ballroom glowed like money always does when it thinks it's untouchable. Crystal chandeliers, white linen, gold-rimmed glasses clinking in careful celebration. The kind of room where power wore tuxedos and called itself philanthropy. I stepped inside, alone. My dress was navy, simple, controlled, chosen for invisibility. If anyone looked closely, they would have noticed my hands were steady. That was intentional. Eyes followed me as I crossed the marble floor. Some curious, some relieved, some already counting my obedience. I spotted them immediately. Board members, donors, men who'd watched me grow up like I was a ledger waiting to be signed. My mother's friends smiled first. She came, one of them murmured. Of course I did. They never expected me to run. A man in a tuxedo approached, holding 2 champagne flutes. You look radiant, he said. I took one, didn't drink. Thank you, I replied. You look temporary. His smile faltered, just a fraction. He didn't understand yet. Across the room, I caught sight of my father's oldest friend, chairman of the board, architect of my future. He raised his glass in greeting. I returned the gesture. That was the first crack. He waited in the shadowed corridor beyond the service doors. Leather jacket instead of a tux. Hair combed back, but still unmistakably out of place. That was the point. When our eyes met from across the glass doors, something in my chest steadied. He tapped his watch. 5 minutes. I nodded once. They didn't waste time. A waiter cleared plates. The lights dimmed slightly. Music softened. The chairman stood. Tonight, he announced. We celebrate continuity. Applause followed. Polite. Automatic. I felt it then. The shift. Folders appeared on the table in front of me. Cream-colored. Embossed. My name printed in careful script. Just a formality, the man beside me said softly. I opened the folder. Marriage contract. Asset clause. Non-disclosure agreement. Everything they'd built my life toward. I closed it again. I'll need a pen, I said. Relief flickered across their faces. Someone handed me one. Black ink. Permanent. I stood. Chairs scraped softly as people turned toward me. I'd like to say something, I said calmly. The chairman smiled. Of course. I took a breath. This was the moment, not the signing, the choice. I want to thank everyone, I began. For gathering here tonight? Nods. Smiles. For years, I continued. This foundation has spoken about legacy. Applause. But legacy, I said, isn't about control. Silence crept in. I reached into my clutch, pulled out a cassette tape, held it up. You recorded everything? I said, looking directly at the chairman. So did I. Murmurs rippled through the room. I walked to the podium, inserted the tape, pressed play. My father's voice filled the ballroom. She'll sign. She always does. Another voice. If she resists, remind her who she belongs to. A third. Marriage will secure compliance. Gasps. Someone stood. Turn that off, the chairman barked. I didn't. Faces drained of color. Sponsors whispered. A reporter near the back raised her camera. This recording, someone began, is real, I said, and it's only part of it. I reached for the second tape. The room leaned forward. Outside the glass doors, I saw movement. Jack, positioned like a shadow with a pulse. Ready. Two men in dark suits approached. Their hands reached out, and then the lights died. A sharp crack. The sound system cut. Screams snapped through the ballroom like broken glass. In the dark, a hand found mine. Steady, familiar. We moved. We slipped behind curtains, through service doors, into narrow corridors that smelled like butter and hot metal. Kitchens flashed by. Chefs frozen mid-motion, trays rattling, staff shouting over the alarms. Footsteps hammered behind us. Jack pulled me through a fire door and out into the night. The air hit my lungs like cold truth. The city kept breathing, indifferent. We didn't stop until the noise was distant and the streetlights felt safer than the chandeliers ever did. Under one flickering lamp, my knees finally trembled. Not from fear, from release. Jack watched me like he was memorizing the version of me that had survived. No comfort speeches, no drama, just the quiet certainty of someone who understood. There was no going back. Freedom landed heavy, not like victory, like responsibility. We sat on the hood of the car, listening to traffic hum like nothing had changed. For the first time since Baltimore, there was no car tailing us. No footsteps, no hands reaching. Then his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered without speaking, then handed it to me. A voice slid through the line. Calm, amused. You embarrassed powerful people tonight, it said. There will be consequences. My eyes closed. Personal ones. The line went dead. Jack didn't flinch. But I saw it then, clear as a headline. Freedom had a price, and we were about to pay it. Morning arrived quietly. No sirens. No pounding at the door. No headlines yet. Just thin sunlight and the sound of Jack's breathing across the room. Alive. Still here. A miracle that didn't ask to be believed. By noon, the world caught up. Radio voices used careful words. Investigation. Board response. Restructuring. Names still hidden, but circling closer. We packed without ceremony. 2 bags, no destination. Only motion. That evening, Manhattan swallowed us in noise and light. For once, I didn't duck from cameras. When a reporter called my name, I let the truth stand without decoration. Yes, the word felt solid. Later, a call came from a law firm. Protection, counsel, a seat on the rebuilt board. A chance to take my name back and make it mean something other than obedience. I said yes. In the quieter hours, Jack and I stood on a fire escape above the city, letting the wind do what it always did, erase the past in small, steady pieces. He carried his distance like armor. I carried mine like a habit I was trying to unlearn. The next morning, a package arrived. No return address. Old photographs, legal documents, a letter in my father's handwriting, cold, controlled, almost respectful. No apology, no threat, just proof the old world had noticed the new one. At the train station, the same kind of place where everything began, I watched Jack hesitate, not out of fear, out of choice. The train arrived, wind rushing through like a held breath finally released. He lifted my bag without being asked, and we stood side by side as if we'd learned a new way to exist. Not owned, not chased, just choosing. Months later, the foundation changed hands. Records opened. Names fell. Power redistributed. I testified without shaking. I spoke without begging. Jack didn't disappear. And one night, in a city that no longer frightened me, I understood the simplest truth of all. I hadn't been rescued. I had been witnessed. I didn't need an escort anymore. I needed someone who chose me after the danger ended. And I finally chose myself. Subscribe for more stories about resilience, self-worth, and choosing yourself.